The poetic devices used by the poet. The poem Wind is having no rhyming scheme. Now students, when you will read the poem, you will see that it's having no rhyming scheme. You will look at the last words of every line of the poem and you will see that none of the words are rhyming. Therefore, you can call this poem to be a free verse. Now, let us see the figures of speech used in the poem. Now, what is a figure of speech? A figure of speech is a figurative language that is used to draw a picture in the mind to convey a message or idea much quicker, effective and vividly. So, when a poet feels that he wants his readers to understand what he's trying to say or what's there in his mind, very quickly he wants to convey the message, he uses certain poetic devices to write the poem. And that makes the poem very effective. Now let us see the figures of speech used by the poet in the poem Wind. Number 1, anaphora. What is this figure of speech? This is a figure of speech in which words repeat at the beginning of successive clauses, phrases or sentences. Now you can understand this better when you will look at the example. Look at the example. Don't break the shutters of the windows. Don't scatter the papers. Don't throw down the books on the shelf. Now you can see that the word don't has been repeated in the beginning of 3 consecutive sentences. So the lines of the poem are an example of anaphora. So you can now understand that the same word has been repeated in the beginning of the sentence, and that too in the beginning of 3 consecutive sentences. So this is an example of anaphora. Now your task is to find another example of anaphora from the poem and write it down in your copy. Now the second figure of speech is repetition. What is this figure of speech? As the name suggests, this is a figure of speech in which words are repeated within a short space of words with no particular placement of the words to secure emphasis. Now sometimes what it happens when we speak, we repeat a certain word. Why we do this? We do this to put emphasis on the word. That word is very important for the speaker. So the speaker repeats that word. And the same thing is done by the poet also. He repeats certain words when he writes a poem, just to put emphasis on the word, just to show that how much that word is important, and that word, it is conveying a message to us. For that he does it. Now look at the example. Frail, crumbling houses, crumbling doors, crumbling rafters, crumbling wood, crumbling bodies, crumbling lives, crumbling hearts. So this is an example of repetition. What is the meaning of the word crumbling? Crumbling means crushing. Now when the wind blows, various things get destroyed. Various things that comes in the way of the wind gets crushed. So he is expressing through these lines the destruction caused by the wind. He is trying to put the picture in the mind of the readers, that is, what exactly the wind does, what is the power of wind when it blows with a great force. You will notice that the word crumbling has been repeated several times to lay emphasis on it. The poet has repeated the word to point out to the readers that the wind causes by crumbling everything that comes on its way. Now the third figure of speech is alliteration. Now what is this figure of speech? This is the figure of speech in which a series of words, usually two or more neighboring words, have the same first consonant sound. However, sometimes repetition of sounds occur inside a word. The sounds created by alliteration establish a certain mood, emotion and rhythm in text. So to create a mood, a certain mood, it may be a happy mood, it may be a sad mood, whatever it is, to create a mood, the poetic device alliteration is used by poets. So in this figure of speech you will find that in a line of a poem, two or more than two words will have the initial consonant sound. Remember, it's sound, not alphabet. Sound is repeated. If you find such repetition in a line, you can say that it's an example of alliteration. Now look at this example. The wind god winnows and crushes them all. Now you can notice that the ver sound has been repeated in this line. The wind, the wind god winnows ver. The ver sound has been repeated. It's a consonant sound and therefore it's an example of alliteration. You will notice that the initial consonant sound W has been repeated in the line of the poem. This has been done by the poet to create a certain mood, to express the characteristics of wind to the readers. Here the line is an example of alliteration. Now there's a task for you. Your task is to find out another example of alliteration from the poem and write down in the copy. Now let's come to the next figure of speech, personification. This is a figure of speech which is used for an inanimate object or animals or birds look or feel human. The poet uses this device to give human traits and qualities such as emotions, desires, sensations, gestures and speech to the object. In simple words, anything that is non-living, or it may be living but it's not a human being, and that has been given the human quality by the poet, you can say that the poetic device used by the poet is personification. Now look at the example. You are very clever at poking fun at weaklings. You are Here the poet is talking to the wind, and he imagines wind to be a human being, and he is giving this wind the human quality of calling it as clever. You are very clever. He calls the wind to be very clever at poking fun, that is making fun at weaklings, making fun of the weak. So this is an example of personification. The poet is here talking to the wind. He says that the wind is very clever and it makes fun of the weak. He gives a human quality to the wind by calling it clever. He talks about the activities carried out by the wind. Again, there's a task for you. There are many examples of personification in the poem, so students, you will write down at least 2 examples of personification in the copy. Now the next figure of speech is metaphor. This is a figure of speech in which 2 things or qualities are compared which are unlike. Now 2 things, they are not at all same, but they are compared. The poet thinks that they can be compared and they have some similarity, and so he does the comparison. We can also say that comparison of 2 objects are done without the use of the words like or as. Now here lies the difference between metaphor and simile. When we will go through an example of simile, we will see that there also a comparison is done. 2 things are compared, 2 objects are compared, but that comparison is done by using the word like or as. But in case of metaphor, which is also a comparison, the word like or as, these are not used. Now look at the example. The wind god winnows and crushes them all. Here winnows, meaning of the word winnows is separation of chaff from grains. Now here winnows is a metaphor for separating the weak from the strong. So it is also separation that the wind does, the wind god winnows, but it is not separating chaff from the grains, but it's separating weak from the strong. And that is what the comparison is done from the original task of winnowing, which involves separation of grains, and here in the poem, according to the poet, the wind god also separates, but separates the weak from the strong. So this is an example of metaphor.